is it still worth living in Lisbon?
Lisbon is very expensive now.
James, thanks so much for joining me and talking about what life in Lisbon's like. So if you could explain kind of how you got here, and let's start at the beginning, right?
So I really came to Lisbon because of the pandemic. I'd never been to Portugal before. Before the pandemic, I was living in Colombia for almost 4 years. And then with everything happening, needed to come back to Europe. Came to Lisbon for a week and didn't take my flight home and stayed here for a year. So it was kind of unintended, but I did always have Portugal in mind. I spoke some Portuguese from Brazil and wanted to improve it because I already spoke Spanish and had kind of heard of several people coming here, seen pictures, and then when I came to visit, I just fell in love with the city, the country, the culture, the language, and stayed. And 2.5 years later, I'm still here.
Okay, so we've got a lot to unpack because you talked about language, culture, the city of Lisbon, which we definitely want to touch on because you came at a time when Lisbon was in a different spot than it is now. So we want to unpack that for the viewer.
Yeah, totally. So I arrived when there were no tourists coming, really. So the city was a bit of a ghost town. In fact, there was still like curfews and lockdowns for the first few months that I was here. And so I was staying in Chiado, which, if anyone who knows the city, is like the center of the center, like the commercial area. And yeah, there was no one on the streets. It was very surreal. Luckily, I already knew a few people here, so I did have networks to kind of tap into. Otherwise, it would have been very hard to meet people. Gradually, over the 2 years after that, the city started to get busier and busier, and then, well, I was going to say back to normal, but people say it's even busier than it was before the pandemic.
Feels that way
now. Yeah, and so I moved out of the very central area because it was too much when the city was back to normal. I mean, I'm still very central, but not as central as I was before. And now I'm starting to travel more for work, but also there've been some significant events and things happening here for work, and yeah, decided to stay here permanently. It's a great place to be based in.
Okay, so you have the advantage of being British in a time that you moved here pre-Brexit.
I had the advantage of being
you had the advantage, right? So you didn't have to go through the visa process and everything.
So to clarify, I am still British. When I arrived was 2 or 3 months before the Brexit deadline, and I was very lucky that meant that I could arrive, and moving here was as easy as for any other European citizen. Right. And because I registered before that deadline, it meant that I was able to stay and did not have to go through the immigration process that any British person now has to, or any American or other nationality has to. So it made things easier.
So that's one major hurdle that a lot of people have to go through, especially British now have to take that leap. Now the other one is language. A lot of people say that in Lisbon you can get by with just English, but you really had an inner desire to learn Portuguese, right?
Yeah. So I already spoke Spanish, and that helped at first. Now I really struggle. We'll get into that in a little bit, switching between Spanish and Portuguese. But that wasn't a major motivation for me to learn Portuguese. And I'd never been to Portugal, but I'd spent some time in Brazil. So I had a bit of exposure to Brazilian Portuguese. But I think for me, if I'm wanting to stay here and wanting to live here, it would be possible to live here and only speak English. But I kind of felt a bit of a desire to want to learn Portuguese, to really be able to get the most out of the country. And I think Portuguese people do appreciate that and do encourage that. So I think it's definitely been worthwhile for me to push that learning Portuguese.
Okay, so I know a little about your background in terms of studying Portuguese because today's video sponsor is with italki, and you did use italki to help learn a little more European Portuguese. Can you give us an indication of how that experience has gone?
I really liked italki as a tool to practice and also to learn. So I had 2 different teachers that I used. One teacher was actually in Mozambique, although he'd lived in Portugal for a while. And that was interesting to get some exposure to Mozambican culture, and he taught a lot about the differences. I think Mozambican Portuguese is closer to European Portuguese than Brazilian Portuguese. And then I had another teacher from Madeira that would be more focused on grammar and Portuguese culture and other aspects. So I used both of those different teachers for a while. And I think for me, although there are lots of schools and lots of opportunities to do in-person teaching in Portugal, it was the flexibility that was really helpful with italki, almost being able to schedule something the day before. Okay, I got some free time tomorrow, or even when I wasn't in Portugal, back in the UK or traveling for work, I could still keep up with those classes, which was really cool.
And how much did lessons cost?
I'm trying to remember. I think it ranged less than 10 euros. There were some teachers, I think the teacher from Mozambique, and that was cool because it just meant that we could have a very casual call that was really just a chat. It was a practice. It wasn't structured. It was just like, okay, we have an hour to talk. Let's do that. The teacher in Madeira charged a little bit more. I think it was close to 15 euros per hour.
Okay.
But that was also more structured. We would go through grammar, have a lesson plan. So it was understandable. And that's still about half the price of what you would pay for in-person private classes in Lisbon. It's a lot more expensive.
Lisbon, okay.
It's a lot more expensive to do the in-person classes here in Lisbon. So the price was also a factor in being able to do it.
Okay. Yeah, because I've seen on the platform starting from like $5 or so.
I think it's cheaper if you take a Brazilian Portuguese class. It can be cheaper because there's a lot more Brazilian teachers on the platform. So there's more competition there. I'm trying to learn both Brazilian and European Portuguese and to be able to differentiate between them. But there are significant differences between the two accents in not just grammar, but vocabulary, pronunciation. I would say that there's more difference than there is between, say, British and American English.
Right.
And so it's important to be able to differentiate and understand both, especially because there are so many Brazilians in Lisbon as well. You get to practice both of them on a day-to-day basis.
That's exactly right. A lot of the drivers, like Uber drivers. Yeah, exactly. Okay, cool. And there's 150 languages on there. So for people that don't just want Portuguese, there's other languages available that people can study.
Yeah. I did use it in the past, I think, when I was learning Spanish as well. Long time ago, I'd used it. But yeah, it's amazing. You can learn Swahili, Urdu, Cherokee. There's like a whole range of languages there. I just enjoyed scrolling through to see all the different availabilities of languages that I'll never learn, but it's cool to know.
Nice. Okay, so that helped with adaptation.
Yeah.
Let's dig in on what life in Lisbon is like and what changes that you've seen over time, and really answer the question, is it still worth living in Lisbon?
Lisbon is very expensive now, and that's been a big difference that people, understandably, there's a frustration from Portuguese people about the level of change that's been witnessed in the city. When I moved here,
and the speed of change?
And the speed of change,
okay.
And I think it's all relative, right? Of course, Portugal and Lisbon even. Lisbon is still cheaper than most big capitals in Western Europe, and definitely than California or New York or kind of more expensive places in the US. There's not the deals that were available before. So housing is one of the big problems in the city now. It has got a lot more expensive in Lisbon. That being said, in the rest of Portugal, I know there's been a push to encourage people emigrating to Lisbon to look at other cities in Portugal. And so outside of central Lisbon, it gets much cheaper, much more quickly. And one of the challenges here is also the local salaries. So Portuguese salaries, people looking to move here and find a job, Portuguese salaries are much lower than the rest of Western Europe, quite shockingly so. And so this sudden price change in Lisbon does impact that. That being said, I think the city has a lot to offer. It's a great hub to be based in. I travel a lot for work. It's got great connections to the rest of Europe, great connections to North and South America and Africa. So it's a really good hub in a lot of ways. And then the city itself is just, I think it's the most beautiful city in the world. It's such a beautiful city. The architecture, the river, the mountains, like the whole setting. And I really like, for me, it's important to be in a city that you can easily escape from, and you have these huge parks in the middle of the city, hiking within 30 minutes of the city, and then obviously beaches 30 minutes away. And I think that gives the city a really nice balance and makes it a really great place to live from a lifestyle point of view.
Okay, so you consider yourself a remote worker, like you don't have a corporate job where you have to go to an office every day?
I've always been a remote worker. I started my career as a remote worker. So yeah, and I run a company. We have a team of 16 and everyone's remote. I've actually not met the majority of my team. We've had entirely remote work for the whole of that,
So you just interviewed them via Zoom and or Skype or whatever?
Yeah, and I think it to me, that kind of was remote first. So I built the company. We actually grew a lot during the pandemic. So we were always a remote first company. And that obviously allows me to be able to live in Portugal with American salary, which is very helpful. But yeah, our team, we do have team members that are based in Porto and Madeira, but also team members in the Philippines, Ghana, Barbados, Trinidad, Canada, Brazil. So we have this really global team that I work with.
Okay, where's the company established?
We're a US-based company.
US-based company.
Because I lived in the US, lived in Colombia, and then eventually ended up in Portugal. But the majority of our clients are in the US and the Caribbean, so US dollars.
Okay.
So it makes sense to be incorporated there, although we are exploring now opening a branch, like a separate company, to be registered in Portugal.
Okay, so you're really a part of, and maybe at the forefront of what is the new normal. There's a lot of people that are moving to Lisbon and moving to Portugal as a remote worker, not so much a digital nomad because they don't plan on like moving around outside of Portugal. What is it like being a remote worker here? How easy is it to find co-working spaces, or is it easy to work from home, internet speed, all of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Lisbon has everything you need for that, and also other parts of Portugal. I think Portugal in general has very good facilities to be a remote worker. I don't really use co-working spaces. I prefer working from home, so I made sure I have a nice space at home that I can work from, because that's just what I prefer. Yeah, internet speed here is fantastic, so it works well for that. I think one of the interesting things in Lisbon now is that it's on people's radar. You know, it used to be that people like North Americans would come to Europe and hit Paris, Milan, Barcelona, and now Lisbon is firmly on that list.
Exactly.
So there's always people that I went to school with, or that I knew in the past, or that I worked with before, passing through Lisbon as tourists, which is quite cool. It's nice to not travel anywhere, but have people, people coming through. One thing that I think is still lacking, but is growing, is the opportunity to kind of meet people from a working point of view. So it's really easy social-wise to meet people. There's lots of meetups, events, things happening, but it's still less developed, I think, in terms of networking on the business side.
Okay.
So I'm trying to explore that, and it may just be that I've not found the right places yet. I'm still trying to explore how I can make more of that, because I do think as a remote worker, sometimes you lack that face-to-face connection and just ability to brainstorm with people in similar situations to you. But then maybe if I went to a co-working space, that'd be easier. Yeah,
it could be. I mean, we've certainly heard about that being very common in Asia, especially Bali. People will go, maybe to the detriment, they'll go to these co-working spaces and then like that's all they do is just talk and ideas, but they don't actually get any work done. Yeah. So let's talk a little about pricing. Earlier you said that there's been a big bump in housing, which we've talked about a lot on the channel. What other things have you noticed have gone up in terms of price, and by how much?
Yeah, it's hard really to, because it happens so incrementally. I find it hard to notice, but definitely things like eating out, going to restaurants, cafes, things like that, there has been a price increase. That's global. We know that there's global inflation is really high, but I've noticed particularly here that there has been a leap, in some places doubling of prices for the new kind of wave of restaurants and eateries that are opening up to cater for a more international audience. Because you have to remember that this really international food scene is quite new to Lisbon. Although all restaurants are seeing an increase in price, there's these kind of new wave of restaurants. That being said, if you go to more traditional Portuguese restaurants, you can still get like a very good meal with a drink starter for like under 10 euros. So that's still very much possible even in central Lisbon. So I think there's also a sense of you have to pick and choose where you go. You can spend a lot of money very easily here, but then when I go to London or to Paris and I see the price of a normal meal, I realize, okay, it's still a lot cheaper to eat here. Supermarkets and stuff, I think, is the same as everywhere. There's that slow increase. And one thing that I did notice is electricity and utilities are a lot more expensive here. So I probably spend twice as much on electricity than I would in the UK, for example.
Oh, wow.
Portugal's known for being one of the more expensive in Europe. So it's interesting. There are some things that you find are actually more expensive. Furniture, I found, was weirdly more expensive than I would have paid in the UK. But overall, I think the cost of living is lower, balances out.
Okay, so did you see an increase like in the last 2 years, or is it just in general double what it would be in the UK?
It's hard to say.
It's been a while since you've been back.
I've not been in the UK for 10 years now.
Okay.
So I go back and I see things, but Yeah, I think the big difference in Lisbon specifically was when the tourists started coming back. You know, a lot of places were resisting that. And then last year, when there was this sudden leap in tourism, of course, things went up. Like people often will look at, oh, cheap flights to Lisbon, let's go, and not realize how expensive accommodation is here. Like to get tourist accommodation or a hotel is the same as most other European cities. You know, it's not cheap. Yeah. So if you're tempted by a cheap flight, look at the whole thing,
whole picture.
Before, if you make sure you know your budget.
Okay, so you're saying in 2023, Lisbon still worth it?
I think it's still worth it. Yeah, it's not as cheap as Chiang Mai or Medellin or other big hubs, but I think for the quality of life and the things that the city offers for a city of this size, it's a good deal.
If you guys are sold on Lisbon, check out this playlist right here. And we want to thank the sponsor of this video, iTalki, for making this possible. James, appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, let's get moving.